3 generations of my mother's family claims Delray as their home since moving from Jamaica. We know of at least 6 generations of my father's that claim American soil as their home. I went to school here in Delray for elementary, middle, and high school. I went to this county for college. But there was one crucial moment that would dictate me becoming an advocate for history. When I was about 18, my parents were conducting their annual rewatching of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The extended edition, make sure you know this. But there was a crucial moment for me. I realized that not a single one of the main characters was black. Now, they redeemed themselves with the Rings of Power series, but I digress. My mind was blown at the time. And so when this happened, there was now an urge within me to learn about the brown and black cultures in fantasy and history. In doing so, when I went to college, and as I spent many years at Renaissance festivals, I would eventually learn about Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. However, about 24, as I conducted my own annual rewatching of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, extended edition, I then had a moment in my exploration of America's history where I learned about something very peculiar: the priorities of freedom. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, democracy, and equality. What does life mean to you? Existence, love, happiness. To me, ultimately, it is about experience, good or evil, passion or pain. What about liberty? Perhaps liberation. All the aspects of freedom that allow you to experience it. Having land, owning a home, having a family. For a pursuit of happiness, it might seem a bit simple, but realistically, we all have phones. I can contact quite actually anyone, anywhere on Earth. It's pretty amazing. Anything you don't believe that we say, you can just Google it. I feel like that's underappreciated. That's actual magic, and we are, of course, making huge strides in the pursuit of happiness. And with democracy and equality, these are aspects for any country that promises to fight for freedom or civil rights for all. This is where I begin the context of our story, at the Spady Museum here in Delray Beach at the historic West Settlers District. As a museum educator, it is my role to preserve this history and educate others on this history and how we are connected. When I first walked into the museum, I saw a giant information panel, and at the top of it, it said, "The priorities of freedom." I knew I had to be there. 2 years later, I now teach about something called the crucial century. 50 years before and 50 years after the 1922 arrival of the namesake of our museum, Solomon D. Spady, one of Delray Beach's first black educators and well-known advocates. 50 years before him was the era of Reconstruction. 50 years after him, in 1970, would be the end of the Civil Rights Movement. This is, of course, when we then have to speak about the decade that Spady arrives himself, the 1920s. Remember that we have humans who live for 100 years. So what was happening one lifetime ago in the 1920s? That was the suffrage movement, women's rights to vote. That was the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Migration. That was an era of manufacturing, refrigerators, televisions, automobiles. There's a reason it was called the Roaring Twenties. What was happening 1.5 people ago? In the South, I'd potentially be enslaved, my voice silenced. This context is not long ago, and the history that affects us goes back 1.5 human lifetimes ago. With that knowledge, I have a heavy question for you. At the end of the Civil War, America's population was 36 million. Of that number, how many were counted as Black Americans? It's not a trick question, I promise. Our country is notorious for misleading history books, that's okay. But it is 4.5 million Black Americans. How many were enslaved? 4 million of them. This is kind of integral when you're thinking about this number. It connects us and understands that they are thrust into freedom directly after a war where the country is figuratively and literally attempting to tear itself apart with the Civil War. So let's begin with Reconstruction. 5 days after the war is over, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson assumes the role of president. This is often when you would hear about the 40 acres and a mule talking point. A Union general by the name of William Sherman is offering 40-acre parcels to each of the newly freed Black American families at this time. However, our president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern-born politician and previous slave owner, supported the institution of slavery. He pardoned most of the leaders of the Confederacy after the war. A travesty of liberty, who would also cancel the budget of something called the Freedmen's Bureau, one of the only government organizations actually helping Black voters at the time and elected officials. Not only that, he would end up giving back the 1.6 million acres of land that had already been allocated to 40,000 Black Americans at this time. With this happening, this failure of Reconstruction to actually reconstruct leads to the permeating nature of the Ku Klux Klan as they hunt, harm, and harass Black voters in the South. Also, many legally voted and elected Black officials. With this happening, we see the Ku Klux Klan become the first consistent system of policing in our country. For the advocates of the Confederacy, only about 10 years after the end of the Civil War, they win their war. We see many of the original leaders of the Confederacy pardoned and voted back into office. We see the Ku Klux Klan now essential to judge, jury, and executioner, as well as enforcer. This leads to the rise of the private prison industry in the South. With this happening, we see the 1880s and 1890s legally solidify this with Black codes and vagrancy laws, discriminatory laws tailor-made to each state as the cry for states' rights over big government calls out. We understand that this is also evidenced by the 1896 Supreme Court decision of separate but equal. I want you to really think about what a room full of wealthy, land-owning American men are considering for 40 million souls. Can you actually separate all aspects of life? Is that hurtful or harmful or helpful to the cultures? And do you see anything similar to that in today's time, domestic or foreign? In the 1900s, we are building towards World War I in 1914 to 1918. This is, of course, an era of manufacturing, so we see America building 40% of the world's goods, 80% of the world's automobiles. This, of course, leads to industrialization and education fueled within the country, but at the same time, in the South, inflammatory factors would lead to an inevitable era of atrocities and horrors. Context is important, so here it is. The movie named Birth of a Nation came out in 1915. It is one of the most impactful propaganda films of all time. It is so impactful, not only did Woodrow Wilson play it in the White House as president, but it would raise the numbers of the Ku Klux Klan to over 3 million members. This would change the history of the Civil War, written 50 years after the war. Not only that, a peculiar man by the name of Adolf Hitler would use this in his propaganda machine a few decades later. With this being the case, we also understand that the Daughters of the Confederacy come into existence. They create hundreds of monuments in the Deep South that celebrate the leaders and accomplishments of the Confederacy and KKK, erasing and, I should say, disconnecting them from the previous history of the era before them. Have you heard of Tulsa, Oklahoma's Black Wall Street? In 1921, this was a self-sustaining, successful Black town in Oklahoma, and it was also the site of a brutal massacre. 300 lives were taken, primarily Black Americans, with over 35 acres of commercial property burned and destroyed. If you have or have not heard of Tulsa, I highly recommend you researched two of Florida's own massacres, Okoye in 1920 and Rosewood in 1923. We have to remember that this is at the exact same time that Solomon D. Spady arrives in South Florida. In 1922, we see him arrive here. In 1926, he ends up building his home and marries a woman by the name of Jessie B. Green. He would indeed become a principal for 28 years and a teacher for 5 years after that. Although they never had children, realistically, after 3.5 decades of teaching hundreds of children, I don't really have any further expectations for them. So, with that being the case, we also know that his primary contribution was as an advocate for education. He brought skills like carpentry, smithing, and farming, skills that, if no one teaches you, are pretty hard to just randomly figure out yourself. He had the first house in the neighborhood with running water, indoor electricity, and an indoor bathroom. My friends, with that being the case, we're going to see how advocates like Solomon D. Spady, who indeed bring education and curriculum to underdeveloped communities, are going to be integral to more people realizing the concepts of the Declaration of Independence. Concepts like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, democracy, and equality. Despite these priorities, Jim Crow existed in earnest, an era of laws and an era that would hinder the progress of people advocating for the priorities of freedom. This is an era of published stereotypes, such as Black people don't feel pain the same way. Sometimes they're lazy or unintelligent. Asian Americans, of course, they're bringing over the opioids and trying to steal our jobs. Indigenous populations, of course, their backwards mentality in the deserts and savagery. Women, or in other words, 50% or more of our entire population, expected to be birthing chambers, trophy wives, or witches. Put them in a psychiatric ward if they dare challenge the patriarchy. My people, the ceaseless struggle of our country is that if you are a person of color, an immigrant, or a woman, many of its systems simply were not made for you to benefit from them. We have to remember that race as a concept globally was created in the 1800s in America. When we are thinking about this, we can look back at historical medieval empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Moroccan Empire, the Roman Empire. We can directly see that race was not the primary dividing factor or unifying factor of these great empires. We have to remember how borders and history dictates who we believe deserves to be on either side of those borders. Do you see anything similar to that centuries later in our own time today? Have you heard of redlining? In the 1930s, we would see infrastructure, education, gentrification, gerrymandering, law enforcement, access to healthcare, access to food, access to income, every single one of these directly affected by the phenomenon of redlining. In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Association would go on to color code 200 of America's major cities. Green, you would have as high-value real estate. Blue, you would have as commercial districts. Both of these, of course, you must invest into. Yellow would be declining areas or city utilities, recreation. Red would be danger areas or low to middle income housing. Don't invest there. We would directly see redlining dictate where the infusion of resources would go when we think about something like infrastructure. Roads, highways, and railways would cut directly through redlined communities, separating whole neighborhoods from one another. We would end up seeing this separation of cultures that, again, as asked earlier, is this helpful or harmful to societies? When this occurs, we also understand that, again, we see borders directly choosing where investments will go. This is when I call on you to be an advocate, like Solomon D. Spady. Fight for the priorities of freedom, lest they be usurped by the forces of injustice. Work to preserve history so that we do not unwittingly repeat it or allow it to be erased. Ensure that you learn how to educate others so that we do not allow ignorance to demean our collective potential. And I will leave something with you that my dad taught me, and I hope it guides you as well. Heroes are not made during good times. Be an advocate. Thank you.